So welcome once again to the Thoracic Guru series. As usual, let's get a few ground rules laid down before we introduce our speaker. The first and foremost is make sure that you switch your microphone off. So who's Prashant Hoval? Hoval, just switch your microphone off. And Alan will talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then I will try and moderate the session and try and get in a few questions, and then I will leave the floor open for everybody. Okay, so without much ado, let me introduce my dear friend Alan. Professor Alan Sihoe is from Hong Kong. He was working with the Hong Kong University and also at Shenzhen and at Shanghai. So he's an honorary professor at Shanghai. But I think now he has changed from the Hong Kong University to the Hong Kong International Medical Center, which I believe is one of the new private setups in Hong Kong. And Alan is a very big name in thoracic surgery. He is the associate editor and the editor-in-chief of thoracic section of the European Journal of Cardiothoracic Surgery. And he has a deep understanding of evidence and of all the literature. And he's the right guy to tell us how we should go about basing our practice on evidence-based medicine. And more importantly, he's going to tell us about how do papers get accepted? And more importantly, why do papers get rejected? So, Alan, the floor is all yours. Please take your time. There is no time limit on this session. So tell us all about how we can make sure that our papers get accepted in international journals.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen now.
Yes, please.
See if this works. Okay, share. Okay, great. Okay, so basically what I'm going to be talking today about is a little bit different from the rest of this lecture series that Professor Khan's arranged. So instead of talking about surgical subjects, we're going to talk about academic subjects, specifically how your paper is reviewed by journals and gets rejected. Because all of us as thoracic surgeons, we do have an obligation to our peers and our specialty to share our knowledge. That's the only way we can improve each other and improve our care for our patients, is if we get our experience from our clinical practice, you publish it, and that's the only way other people can learn from you. And to do it effectively is a very important part of medical communication. And what I've been doing over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years is I've been working with a number of international journals as an editor and certainly as a reviewer of a couple of dozen different journals. So over the years, I've got a lot of experience from the other side, from the reviewer side, and I can see what good papers are made of, and I also see more often what bad papers are like and why people get rejected. So we're going to share with you some of the behind-the-scenes look at how your paper is reviewed by the journals and is rejected. Now, let's begin with you, because all of you out in the audience, I think at some stage or another, have either published or were thinking of publishing. And very often in our specialty, it's a situation of publish or perish. It's easy for us to operate and be surgeons, but how do people know that you're a good surgeon? If you talk about all the so-called famous thoracic surgeons around the world, you know all of them by name. They're famous, but do you know how well they operate? Not always. You know them because of their publications, and nowadays also by their video articles. But nonetheless, the only way we can make it in this world is to publish, 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 especially if you work in an academic institute or a university. And you all know that if you don't publish well, you will perish, you will flounder, and you won't succeed. So very often, as I go around the world as an editor, the most common question I get asked by people is, why did you reject my paper? And believe you me, I've rejected countless papers over the years. And everybody, you know, they never ask you when their paper is accepted, why you accept their paper. They do ask you why their paper gets rejected. And there are many excuses that authors give themselves as to why their own paper was rejected. they often say, oh, it must be prejudice. The reviewers, the journal, the editors, well, they don't like me. They don't like my country. They don't like my institute. They don't like my boss. And therefore, they rejected me because of that. I'm not in the group. I'm outside the peer group. And I can tell you absolutely 100% this is not the case. Yeah, there are friends and enemies within thoracic surgery, but good reviewers and good editors, they do have a moral stance, and they don't let this happen. And I can tell you because most journals employ at least 2, 3, or 4 reviewers per paper. Usually that balances itself out. If there are some friends and enemies who review your paper, the other reviewers are not your friends and enemies. And usually it's easy to spot, the biased reviews. And those really the editors don't pay attention to that. The other thing that a lot of authors give as an excuse for why their own paper was rejected was, well, my English is not very good. They rejected me because I can't write in English. And here's my favorite cartoon from a journal in China. And basically what it says is, if you publish your paper in English and you look like a guy who's fluent in English, everybody will worship you. But if you look Chinese and you publish in Chinese, or your English isn't very good, then nobody's going to care about you. And that's often an excuse. But again, I can tell you now that is never a reason for rejection. A good reviewer and a good editor will always see through the language barrier. Most surgeons, thoracic surgeons around the world, are not native English speakers. And we understand that. Most of the reviewers themselves are not native English speakers. And so therefore, language is usually not a reason for rejection. Obviously, if your English is so bad nobody can understand your paper, yeah, then it won't get a good review. But by and large, good reviewers can see through that. They can see the science behind it. And so this is not really an issue. And last but not least, some people say, well, maybe it's the reviewers or the editors. They have personal opinions on this topic that I'm writing about. And that's the reason for rejection. For example, I'm writing a paper on uniportal VATS. Maybe the reviewers hate uniportal VATS, and that's why they rejected me. Well, I can't deny that sometimes there are preferences amongst reviewers, and there might be a little bit of personal prejudice. But again, over 2, 3, 4 reviewers plus an experienced associate editor, together, they usually balance each other out. And usually the personal opinions or biases of a particular reviewer usually will not overall sway the entire recommendation of a paper. So these are not the reasons for rejection. They are not. What are the reasons why your paper was rejected? Well, there are 3, and it's very, very easy. The first is your paper didn't meet the requirements of the journal. 2, it did not meet the requirements of the journal. And number 3, it did not meet the requirements. Now, you might say, that's a bit of a joke, but we'll see in just a second. These 3 so-called requirements, there are 3 separate different requirements, and you need to fulfill them if you don't want your paper rejected. It's very simple. There's no bias involved. You meet these requirements, your paper should have a good chance of being accepted. So to understand the requirements, who's doing the requiring? Now, this is a scheme when you submit a paper to a journal. So you're the author, you're the hero of the story. You want to, save the day, you want to do good, you want to get your paper accepted. But in your way are your 3 enemies. One are the editorial staff, and they're like the droids. They're really not really evil. They try and help you by and large when you submit a paper. But they do things by the book, just like robots, just like droids. If they see your paper is not formatted correctly, doesn't meet the requirements of the journal in terms of the formatting and the referencing and all that, they will send it back to you before it even gets passed on to reviewers. So you must first pass this hurdle of the droids, of the editorial staff. Then you have to get past the reviewers, and they're like the army of stormtroopers. And every journal has an army of stormtroopers, and they hold the fort. So your paper goes to these reviewers, and you have to get past these guys before your paper gets any further. And last but not least, in fact, it's most important, you have the editor, and he's the great Dark Lord of the Sith. He's the evil master. He holds the power of life and death over your paper. So the stormtroopers report to the editor. They can recommend to the editor whether or not to accept or reject your paper, but ultimately it's the editor who decides, not the reviewers. The reviewers make the recommendation. The editor has always the power to overrule the reviewers if necessary. It's not often, but sometimes they do. And so the editor gets in the way. So now these three groups of people have different requirements. And just to cut a long story short, the three requirements that I talked about just now are these. There is a requirement of quality, of message, and of what I call the intangibles. Now, in terms of quality, very simply, two things: the quality of the science and the quality of the writing. They're two different things. If you're doing a study and you're writing a paper, the science is your methodology and how well you report the results. This has to conform to the highest international standards of scientific study. Your methodology needs to be correct. You need to design your study properly, use the correct statistical tests. You need to define your outcome measures properly, and you need to follow up your patients properly, etc., etc. How well you do your science, and that's usually quite obvious. Less obvious is the quality of the writing. Now, some people will say, science, I have good science, forget about writing. That's not true. If you don't write well, you will not get your message across. The writing has to be clear enough that every reader should be able to understand what you're saying. Now, that is not to say that you need to write in perfect English. In fact, you've probably heard it said before, writing a medical paper requires the simplest primary school English. A man and a pan, or the cat is on the map. Something simple like that. You don't need to write Shakespeare. You don't need to write flowery English. You just need to say A is B. B leads to C. That's all you need to write. And that's absolutely essential. That's the quality. And this is quite objective. Now, the message is something different. You can write a great science and great writing. But if you don't have a good message, then again, this paper is worthless. Now, in terms of message, there are three things to pay attention to. One is originality. Originality, ideally, obviously, it hasn't been written before. But sometimes people make a big mistake. They mistake rarity for originality. They say, this is a very rare disease that I'm reporting on. That's not original. In fact, if anything, rarity is not interesting. Because if it's so rare that nobody's ever seen it before in the last 10 years, then the chances are in the next 10 years, they'll not see it again. And therefore, this particular case is not going to be clinically relevant for readers. It's interesting, you raise your eyebrow, but so what? It doesn't make any difference to their daily practice. So originality doesn't mean rare. It can be a very common disease. In our specialty, something to do with lung cancer or pneumothorax or something, or TB in India. These are very broad, common topics. But if you can find an original question or original angle within a big topic, that might give you an interesting message. The second thing, of course, is impact. What does this paper do to the readers who read it? Does it change their practice? Is it something novel that once they read it, say, oh gosh, I shouldn't be operating in this way anymore. Or maybe I should think about a different study to follow up on. What impact does it have? If you write well, then you can actually suggest the impact to the readers. And last but not least, you need to give a relevance. Is this, okay, it's original, it's got some impact, but is it relevant to the daily practice of most of the readers? If the journal thinks that, yeah, okay, it's pretty original, but this message only affects about 2% of my readership, that journal is not going to publish your paper. For example, if you do a very good molecular study on lung cancer and you submit it to a journal, a surgical journal focused mainly on technique, then it's not going to be relevant to that journal. And that message is wasted on that particular journal. Now, to sum up the message part, very easy, 2 words. So what? If you read the entire paper, your own paper, and at the end of the day, you think, so what? It makes no difference to my practice, then your message is probably pretty weak. If you don't want to ask so what, give it to one of your friends and see if they say, so what? I don't care. If they say that, so I don't care, that paper doesn't carry a good message. And last but not least, there are the intangibles. Now, the intangibles don't fit into these objective categories. Maybe the paper you're writing is very topical. It's very relevant to current practices or current events. We recently published in the ICVTS a paper from Syria because it was talking about war trauma to the chest in Syria. And as we know right now, there's a massive, terrible crisis in Syria with civil war going on. And the experience there is quite interesting to a lot of casual readers. And for that matter, we thought, well, maybe we should publish this. We also have to consider the legal, social, and ethical impact of publishing this particular paper. We don't want to publish a paper that will cause the journal any kind of legal issues or will upset social and ethical problems, whether it will actually affect society. For example, all the papers on vaccines and autism, for example. We need to consider whether this paper is relevant in the journal, and also a little bit of a fun factor. Now, I'll show you some examples in just a second. So when we assess these things, these are the things that the reviewers and the editors think about. Now, to help the reviewers, a lot of journals, this is just taken from the Journal of Thoracic Disease website, a lot of the journals actually help both the authors and the reviewers. They actually say exactly what they're looking for. For example, JTD in the original article, if you go to the website, Instruction for Authors, they will tell you exactly what they're looking for. They're looking for originality. They're looking for clinical impact. If you want to submit a case report to JTD, this is what they look for. Okay, they're looking for unreported adverse events, novel suggestions or pitfalls in diagnosing this disease, etc., etc. If you're writing a technique paper, then again, they specifically say that you should give your expert opinion on this technique, on possible pitfalls, how it compares, with other methods, etc., etc. Read the instructions for the authors. Now, when it comes to the reviewer stage, most journals actually help the reviewers. This is a typical reviewer screen in a couple of journals. And the journals actually ask the reviewers to actually grade the paper according to certain questions. Now, interestingly enough, these grades do not affect whether the paper is accepted or rejected. The reviewer is free to pick whatever score he wants here and here, but ultimately his recommendation, for example here, reject, doesn't necessarily reflect the scores. Nonetheless, these scores are here to help for the journal to help the reviewers think about what they're assessing. So what the journal asks the reviewer to do, you need to assess the scientific accuracy, originality, and interest or impact, relevance to readers. These are exactly the points I said just now. How useful are the findings? What is the impact? How well is it written? How good is the science? So this is just an example. These are the things that will guide the reviewer towards rejecting or accepting the paper. Now, even more recent, some journals, for example, the EJCTS and the ICVTS, they now require what they call a visual abstract. Okay, now visual abstract is simply this. There's a central image that the author needs to display in just one image exactly what this paper is all about. Next to it, they have a visual abstract. Visual abstract is just this. It's basically just three items. The first item is, what is the clinical question in this study? What are your key findings? And what's your take-home message in a very succinct package? Now, why do journals nowadays ask for these visual abstracts and central images? Again, it's to help the reviewer and the editor decide on the relevance and the impact of this paper. Because if you are not able to tell the reviewer in a simple little package like this what your impact of this paper is, the chances are this paper doesn't have any impact. It's probably a so what, who cares kind of paper. So, this actually also helps the author, as he submits a paper, think again, what am I trying to say to the readers? If you don't have a good message, maybe you shouldn't even be submitting this paper. So these are all aids to help authors and reviewers. Now, we talked about the intangibles. Now, a lot of you probably have seen this paper in the BMJ, very famous paper. They were actually comparing a surgeon, a physician, and a film star, okay? And they were actually looking at phenotypic differences, i.e. who's more attractive. And obviously, surgeons came out only marginally behind film stars. Now, why on earth would the BMJ publish a paper like this? Purely because it's funny. There's no scientific value in this. It's not going to change anybody's practice. But sometimes journals do have a sense of humor, especially these British journals. Here's another example. Again, this is actually a bit more subtle. Now, a lot of you probably are aware of this paper. We talked about this on Friday. This is a paper where they compared SBRT versus lobectomy for stage 1 lung cancer, finding that SBRT was better than lobectomy. Now, as we said on Friday, this paper was terrible. It was full of mistakes, full of terrible, terrible errors and poor science. And yet, it was published in the Lancet Oncology, a very high impact factor journal. Why is that? Purely because these guys at Lancet knew that if this is an intangible factor, if we publish this paper, despite its flaws, this will generate citations. It will trigger a lot of debate, a lot of discussions between oncologists and surgeons, and it would have some sort of social impact. So although the paper was bad, Lancet Oncology, I think, succeeded when they accepted this paper. They did actually promote this debate, which was in a way very helpful for all lung cancer clinicians. So this is another example of intangibles. Now, with all that in mind, let's see what happens when you actually submit to a journal. What else do they look for? Now, in the good old days, back in the 90s, if I was a cardiothoracic surgeon and I wanted to submit a paper, easy. There are only a few journals out there. You can submit to one of these. Now, nowadays, things are a lot more difficult. There are so many journals out there. Everywhere. You know all these journals. They're flooding the market everywhere you look. Every day in your email inbox, these journals write to you and ask you to submit papers. They're all trying to make some money. Now, you would think that with so many journals out there, that it's actually easier to have your paper accepted. But for those of you who've actually tried submitting to journals nowadays, you will find that that's not the case. In fact, if anything, it's actually more difficult now to get your paper accepted into the big journals, despite having so many journals out there. And why is that? That's because with so many journals, something funny is happening, something strange, and people are scratching their heads. But again, to simplify matters, the key word here is this: stratification. Stratification. With so many journals out there, all the journals are trying to compete to be number one. They want to be the best journal, and they want to keep themselves up there. The top journals don't want to go down. The bottom journals want to move up the ladder. Now, how do they do that? Very simple. It's all to do with impact factor. The higher your impact factor, the more prestige your journal has. And that it's not only a matter of prestige, it also generates more readership. It generates more advertising money. So all journals want to move up the ladder. And to understand that, okay, you need to understand impact factor. So what do editors and journals want? They want a higher impact factor. How do you get that? Through citations. Because what impact factor is, it's this very simple formula. Basically, Thomson Reuters, this agency, a news agency, they calculate the impact factor for every journal based on this. They look at the number of citations in that journal of articles published in that journal over the last 2 years, divided by the total number of citable articles published in that same journal in the last 2 years. So for example, if I publish 1,000 papers and I get a total of 2,000 citations out of all those papers I published, my impact factor is 2. Nice and easy. Now, how does this affect things? Now, impact factor, as we said, is the key to how journals compare themselves to each other. So this is from an annual meeting of the EJCTS editorial board. It's open knowledge, so I can display it to you. Now, every year at our editors' meeting, we compare ourselves to the other competitor journals, for example, Annals and JTCVS. And every year we see how we rank compared to the other journals. And obviously we try and outdo them. You can see here back in 2016, EJCTS did very, very well. In fact, if anything, it actually caught up and slightly surpassed the Annals of Thoracic Surgery in 2016. That was good news for the EJCTS. Now, how do you actually make your impact factor go up? See, all these journals generally go up over time. Now, you might think that, oh, we publish better papers, but that's not actually true. It's very difficult to accept good papers because you can't control the papers coming in. You can only control what papers you end up publishing, i.e. you can only control your rejection rate. So let's look at the EJCTS. Year on year, their impact factor, well, tended to increase. This year was a bit of an anomaly. But if you look at the nominator, the number of citations they received, it actually stays more or less the same. In fact, if anything, it's gone down a little bit. And yet the impact factor's gone up. How? Because they rejected more papers. The accepted papers went down. Your denominator comes down, your impact factor goes up. It was the same with us in ICVTS. Look at the citations year on year. It's actually quite stable. But the number of papers accepted by this journal going from 880 down to 589. We accepted 300 fewer papers in 2016 than in 2014. And the impact factor went up. Now that is crucial. So this is what happened. The acceptance rate for the EJCTS goes down every year. Right now, the EJCTS is accepting fewer than 1 in 5 submissions. The ICVTS is similar. Look at this massive drop over the years. And again, we're now accepting fewer than 1 in 3 papers. In fact, this year, I think we're getting to close to just 1 in 5 papers, even in the ICVTS. So that helps the impact factor go up. Now, if you look at the top journals, NEJM, for example, New England Journal, look at them. 62% of all submissions going to the New England are rejected outright without any review. The associate editor looks at this paper I don't want, and they reject over 60% of papers without even review. After it goes to review, most of the reviewed papers are still rejected. In fact, the number of papers that they're ultimately going to publish is less than 1% of all submissions. And that is why the NEJM has such a high impact factor. They're very careful in selecting papers, and they reject everything. Now, there's an art to rejection. You don't just reject at random, willy-nilly. You know how to reject papers because of this evidence pyramid. Everybody knows this. Right at the bottom of the pyramid are the case series, the low quality of papers. And as you go up, you go to case control studies, randomized trials, and at the top, you get your systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And surprise, surprise, when we analyze the papers in each journal, these are the papers that year on year get cited more and more. Every year, for example, in the EJCTS or in the Annals, the most #1 cited papers are the meta-analyses and systematic reviews. There's one category of papers even better than that, and these are the official guidelines of societies. For example, if ESTS or EACTS has official guidelines on the management of disease X, and they publish it in EJCTS, that paper is going to create a lot of citations. Down here at the bottom are the case reports and your surgical technique papers. These papers, you as a reader might read them, but I'll tell you one thing, nobody ever cites them. They get 0 citations. And these papers, the journals now know that they hate these papers. They only add to the total number of articles published. They don't get any citations. They're terrible for impact factor. And that's why journals always reject case reports. I reject over 90% of all case reports submitted to me. So if you want to submit different types of papers, what are your strategies? Now, if you're trying to submit a case series, yeah, you can do, but it's very difficult. You need to make sure it's interesting. What's interesting? Like I said just now, rare is not interesting. You might say, oh, that's kind of rare. People might look at it and prod it a little bit, but nobody's going to cite it. No, everybody's going to read it, and the next minute they forget about it. Rare is not interesting. To make a case series or a case report interesting, you need to be able to show one of these things. Does it show any new presentation of a disease? Are you managing in any new way? Or if it's the same presentation and same management, have you learned anything different from what has gone before? If you cannot say yes to any of these questions, the chances are this case series is boring. So the era of a case report plus literature review, when you just show your own case and you just explain, oh, everybody else does it the same way, that paper will not get published nowadays. What about original articles? Most papers submitted to journals are original articles, i.e. the introduction, method, results, and discussion papers. Now, for these papers, they always go through evolution within a certain subject. So if you're talking, for example, about VATS over the years, there are different papers submitted. Now, VATS started in the early 90s, as you know. Now, in the infancy of VATS, you could get by with submitting case reports and case series because VATS was relatively new. As time went on, you can't publish these anymore. You started needing comparative studies showing crude benefit like pain or length of stay. As time went on into the early 21st century, people no longer relied on pain studies. They're too subjective. People relied on things like functional outcomes, inflammatory cytokines, et cetera, and finally, the evidence, the papers matured into the systematic reviews, meta-analysis, big data analysis showing treatment outcomes. Now, the key about all this evolution is that you need to be aware, if you're writing an original article, where your topic has advanced to. Because if you've already advanced to, for example, the adolescence phase, and you're trying to still submit a case report, nobody's going to accept it anymore. They're already looking for these kind of papers. It's like buying an iPhone. If you're already up to iPhone 8 or iPhone X, nobody's going to buy an iPhone 4 anymore, right? So it's the same thing with papers. So let's take a few examples. For example, conventional 3-port VATS. Where are we now? All these papers have been published. We're now at the maturity phase. If you want to publish any kind of papers in these phases, case series, even simple comparative studies, it's not going to be accepted. What about something new like E&B? This is still fairly new. I think we're passing the infancy phase. I think people have shown it's safe and feasible, but it's still, we still haven't really entered the comparative phase. So if you have a paper comparing E&B to other similar modalities, you have a fairly decent chance of getting your paper published. What about things like Reportle VATS? Well, thanks to Diego, who's published so many case reports and case series over the years, we're well past the infancy phase. We're actually going through the childhood phase and into the adolescence phase right now. So even if you have a simple, case control study with some pain as your main outcome measure, it's starting to get difficult to publish Reportle VATS papers. We're really looking for better evidence, level of evidence now. So that's how impact factor affects original articles. Now, when I was a trainee, very often my mentors would say, no, write a review article. That's the easiest thing to write. Pick a topic and just write about it and try and submit it. But nowadays, again, if you look at all the top journals, JTCVS, Annals, EJCTS, how many review articles are there? Not that many. If you want to get a review article accepted into a journal, either you get invited, which is extremely rare, or you need to pick something that is interesting, an interesting topic. Now, if you are going to pick a topic, you need to ask a specific question nowadays. I've received papers, for example, a review on thymectomy. Now, that's a huge topic. There's no way in one review article you can cover everything. So if you are going to write on that, make sure you ask a specific question. For example, thymectomy for what? For myasthenia patients with such a stage of thymoma in a certain age group or whatever. If you can actually find a niche area that is interesting and relevant to readers, and you do a focused review on that topic, maybe you might get through. Even better, you can try doing a systematic review where you actually have a defined search strategy and a strategy for selecting the papers to put into review. And this will improve the chances of your review paper getting accepted. If you have a meta-analysis, if you're good at statistics, perfect. Now, this is the holy grail of writing papers. If you can do a good meta-analysis, These typically give you the highest impact papers. You need to do a Prisma flow chart. You need to do fancy statistics. But beware, nowadays, a lot of people think that this is a shortcut to getting your paper accepted, doing meta-analysis. And a lot of papers from Asia actually use your database data or American database data, and they use some fancy statistics, and they try and get the paper published. But now the journals are starting to catch on. They know that not all meta-analyses are good quality. For example, in this particular meta-analysis, it turned out that one of these papers wasn't even on the topic that they were analyzing. It was faulty. And when you put garbage into a meta-analysis, you get garbage out. And this is something that is very, that journals are nowadays realizing. Not all meta-analyses give you good results. The statistics are actually quite easy to do if you know your maths. What's difficult is this stage, how you actually screen out papers that are not relevant, only leaving good studies into your meta-analyses. And when people actually analyze, for example, the meta-analyses published by Chinese authors, they realized that they weren't doing that. The maths was fine, but they weren't retrieving the information correctly. They didn't look at all the relevant databases, and they didn't really even write the paper well enough to describe the statistical methods. So meta-analyses, it used to be about 5 years ago, most of these got accepted. Nowadays, even these papers are harder to get accepted. Now, I just want to have one final message before I leave you. This is a very quick message, and I think it's especially relevant for those of us in Asia. And that is, there's still a lack of perceived quality in papers from Asia. Now, this is a graphic showing scientific papers, not just medical papers, published around the world. And you can see that the US is still leading the way in terms of number of papers being published. Now, in Asia, we're not actually doing too bad. You see, China is now number 2 in terms of papers being published. In fact, where's India? India's here, again, doing very well. You're right up there with a lot of the European countries. But notice these light blue dots. Now, what do these light blue dots say? These are the top 1% of most cited papers in the world. So if you look at China, for example, they publish a lot of papers, but very few of them get cited multiple times. Look at India, again, a sizable volume, but the number of papers in the top 1% of citations is small. Whereas you compare it to the UK or Germany, their overall volume is not that much bigger than India's, but the number of papers that are cited in the top 1% are much bigger. This reflects the fact that a lot of these European and North American papers are perceived to have higher quality, and that's why people cite them. Now, how can we remedy this? Now, over the years, reviewing so many literally hundreds and hundreds of papers from Asia, I've noticed a few things that Asian authors tend to be poor at, Asian researchers. The first is this. There are cultural differences that limit some of the papers. I'm not talking about linguistic differences. It's not your bad English. Again, I say English doesn't matter. But it's a difference in core beliefs, okay? And what we say in China is 该统纳广, chicken talking to duck. They look similar, but nobody understands each other. And what I'm saying here, we'll take an example, pneumothorax. A lot of Japanese papers on pneumothorax get rejected by American journals. And a lot of Japanese authors ask me, why is that? And after a couple of years, we figured out that actually in Japan, when they do pneumothorax surgery, they never, well, at least in the past, they never did pleurodesis. Whereas in America and Europe, you cannot do pneumothorax surgery without doing pleurodesis. And it was this simple difference in core surgical beliefs that, the Japanese didn't realize what they were doing was quite different from the rest of the world. And that led to a lot of reviewers giving them negative recommendations when they submitted papers. There are other issues, for example, like political correctness. We had one paper submitted to the Annals a number of years ago from China. They were talking about needlescopic VATS, tiny wounds, great cosmesis. But the author made the mistake of saying, because the wounds are so small, this will appeal especially to young female patients because they care more about cosmesis. Now, in China or in parts of Asia, that'd be okay. But when you submit it to an American journal with an American female surgeon, she's going to be offended. This is sexist, and it's just not acceptable writing in the scientific paper, and that paper got rejected. So there are cultural differences, I think, between developing countries and some Western countries. And the only remedy for that, I think, is more engagement. I think for those of you in developing countries, especially in Asia, the only way to break out of this is to engage more, write more, and certainly go to the conferences, meet your Western peers more, and just engage in more conversations with them. And gradually, hopefully, these cultural differences, it's not so much you have to adapt yourselves to them, but also show our beliefs to the others so that they understand us a bit more. I think we need to engage more. The other issue is patient follow-up. Here in Asia, our countries are huge. We have huge populations, and that is an advantage for us when we come to do scientific research, surgical research. The problem is, though, unlike Western countries, most of our patients don't have good follow-up. We do the surgery, they go home, and we don't know what happens to them next. Very often, if you're going to do a retrospective study, the only way you can see your results is you phone the patient up. Are they dead yet? And that's not very reliable. It's all this post-hoc data collection, which a lot of journals, a lot of reviewers find it's not reliable. And it's a very unique problem to most developing countries. And again, the only remedy to that is hopefully we need to establish good databases. We have the population, we have the surgical skills, but what we need to do in Asia is to establish databases. And this is something that we're doing through groups like, for example, ATEP, where we're hopefully establishing databases so that together we can collect prospective databases that will improve the acceptability of our papers. Now, the third and final point is this, and again, I alluded to it earlier. We have numbers in developing countries. You can publish a surgical series, hundreds, even thousands of patients. And a lot of us think that, wow, this will so shock the American and European reviewers that they will definitely accept my paper. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Most people in the West would fall asleep because numbers alone are not enough. If you just tell everybody, look, I did 5,000 uniportal VATS cases last year. You think you're great. Everybody thinks you're boasting. It's boring. You might be interested in your experience. Nobody else is interested in your experience. In order to get your big, huge number experience published, you need to use your experience to answer a relevant clinical question. Don't just boast and say, I did a great number of surgery. You need to be able to answer the question, so what? Yeah, okay, you did 5,000 cases, but what did you find that will help everybody else? Now, that leads us to the theory of the data scientist unicorn, okay? Now, this is how a lot of authors think. You have a big data, you have a big database, I have a lot of patients that I've done, and ideally what the author thinks, he hands it to a data scientist or a statistician, and this statistician does some magic, and he finds P is less than 0.05, and suddenly I have a significant p-value, I have a great result, and I have a great paper. That's what they think. It never ever works like that. P less than 0.05 is not indicative of a very interesting result. This is how it really needs to work. If you have a big question, yes, you engage a statistician, a data scientist, but you don't actually just throw the data at him and ask him to give you P is less than 0.05. What you need to do is to work within your team and with the data scientists to see what this question, what this data can do to solve the big questions in clinical practice. And then you ask your data scientists to find the relevant tests to see if your data will answer that question. And that is the way to good science, not just to throw the data and hope for a P is less than 0.05. Now, I think Gonzalo Varela sums it up, I think, best of all. He is past president of ESTS, and I think, in my own experience in all these years, he is probably the greatest single editor I've ever seen. He's very fair. He writes great comments to all the authors. He gives very reasonable explanations. He's incredibly hardworking. And he has pinpointed, I think, the central issue. in framing a clinical question, because he sees that authors write papers for 4 different reasons. The first reason is they write for personal prestige. There are some people out there who just want to write a paper so that they are listed as a first author or a senior author. I'm so cool. I have written a paper and it got published in the JTCVS. I'm a hero. Now that's terrible. It's a very low starting point. You don't really care about science. You just worry about your own self. Another group of authors write it, well, they're not just writing it for personal fame and gain. They're writing it because their career demands it. They might work in a university where they're assessed on how many papers they publish every year. There's a pressure on them to publish, and that's fair enough. But again, because you're pressured to write a paper, very often your starting point is not, I want to do good science. It's, I want to write a paper. And then you find some science to write about. And that's not a very good starting point. Getting it slightly better is if you have a message. Maybe you did some research, your team did some research, and along the way you find a message. That's an interesting message. Nobody else has written about that before. Let me write about it. That gives you a better paper. And I think Gonzalo likes this kind of paper if you have a good, clear message. But best of all is if you are trying to write to improve the lot of your patients and patients around the world. So you not only have you did a study that you found some good results, maybe you started off doing the study in the first place because you have a good clinical question and you're asking the clinical question to help people. And when your results, whether it's a positive result or a negative result, is therefore worthy of sharing with the world. Maybe you have a good hypothesis. It was a negative result, but that's still an important message to get across. Now, why do I think these 4 items are so important? That goes back to what we were saying earlier, about clinical question. If you actually start off with just thinking about your own prestige, your own career, you never start off with a good clinical question. You just want to write a paper and then you find something to write about. You will never have a good clinical question. And what that means is your message is always going to be weak. But if you actually starting off down here, you actually start off from a starting point of doing good science, even if you find a negative result, you actually are trying to address a real day-to-day relevant clinical question. This will actually show. And to a good editor like Gonzalo, these experienced editors, literally within the first 2 minutes of reading your paper, they can already tell your starting point. It's so obvious to us, just reading your introduction, your abstract, where you're starting off. If I can see that, you really don't have a clinical question and you're just writing for your prestige, you can guarantee that as I read through the rest of this paper, I know this paper is going to be pretty crappy and the chances of being accepted are poor. So this is, again, something to consider. So just to wrap up, this is my last slide. Take-home messages. I think the first thing to note is that the traditional criteria for accepting papers, 3 requirements: requirement of quality, requirement of message, and requirement of intangibles. All journals, when you submit to them, they always care about the impact factor. And because of that, different types of articles, whether it's a case report, original article, review, or meta-analyses, they will be accepted with different considerations. So always pay attention to that. And you need to develop different strategies really to increase the chances of your article being accepted. Remember the evolution of the original articles we talked about. And last but not least, for those of us still working in developing countries, be aware of our weaknesses and where we come short, and pay attention to these considerations, because certainly the reviewers will as well. And with all that, hopefully you will have success, and I wish you all good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. Alan, would you stop sharing your desktop so that we can see you on the screen?
Okay.
Fantastic. So I think that is just such an amazing talk and such a valid talk in this modern day and era for the young surgeons, because really almost all the people that I speak to, I meet and I talk and I teach, almost all of them are struggling with how to publish a paper. It's a very simple question, and they're all struggling with it. So let me start off by asking you a few questions. I'm going to start off with asking you to repeat something which you said during your talk, purely because a couple of them are exam going. So I want you to explain to us again, what is an impact factor? And within the cardiothoracic community, what are the numbers that they need to remember when they're talking about journals on one of the tables of VATS?
Okay, so impact factor, it's an index developed by a company, actually, a media company, Thomson Reuters. Everybody knows Reuters, a news company. It's the same company. So what Thomson Reuters does is they look at a certain bunch of journals called the SCI journals, the Scientific Citation Index journals. For each journal, they look at this journal's records over the last 2 years. So they look at all the relevant articles that were published in that journal,
Okay.
and then they look at all the total number of citations of the articles in that journal over the last 2 years.
Can I stop you there? Can I ask you what constitutes a citation? What do you mean by citation?
Okay, so if another journal contains a paper that in the reference list has an article from your paper, that's a citation.
So it is being mentioned in the reference column.
That's right. That's right.
Does a letter to an editor can be counted as a citation?
Yes, actually, I think it does, actually. But yes, I think it does. As long as it's cited, it will be included.
So the top number is the number of times you have been cited.
That's right.
The bottom number?
The bottom number is the total number of articles you published over the last 2 years.
Okay.
So if I publish, if I publish 1,000 papers, but I get cited 2,000 times, my impact factor is 2.
Okay. So basically, you cannot control the top number, but you can control the bottom number as an editor. So what you do is you actually reject a lot more articles so that the bottom number goes down, hence your impact factor goes up. Is that correct? Was that the
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
This was on behalf of all the students. I'm just sort of repeating what you said.
Very important point.
Within the cardiothoracic community, which are the top impact factor journals? What is the rating? I know you showed a graph there, and I know the answer, but I want you to repeat it in case somebody is asked in an exam.
Yeah. So within cardiothoracic surgery itself, pure cardiothoracic surgery journals, we typically have the big 4. So that's the JTCVS, that's number 1 traditionally, and then it's the Annals of Thoracic Surgery.
Yeah, Journal of Thoracic and Cardiovascular Surgery. That's
right.
Who publishes that?
They are owned by AATS.
Okay.
So the Annals is owned by STS in America. The EJCTS, the European Journal, is owned by EACTS, but it's also the official journal of ESTS, and they're usually number 3. And ICVTS is also an index journal, but it's a sister journal, the lower sister journal of EJCTS. So it's also owned by EACTS. Okay. Now, of these 4 journals, JTCVS nowadays has an impact factor of around 5, I think. Annals is around 4. EJCTS is around 3 to 4. So this is cardiothoracic. But of course, within our specialty, we don't just publish in cardiothoracic journals. We publish in respiratory journals. For example, chest, that goes up to, I think, in the teens. I think I'm just under 20 in impact factor. That gives you an idea how much bigger they are than we are. And then, of course, you can publish in oncology journals. So the relevant oncology journals to us would be JCO, JTO. JCO, I can't remember. Again, it's a very high impact factor. And of course, you can go all the way up to Lancet, New England, but that's dreaming.
So when these candidates are quoting a paper in the examination, does it mean that a journal, an article from a journal with a higher impact factor has more scientific validity than a journal, than an article from a journal with a lower impact factor?
Very good point. In general, of course, yes. I mean, if you can cite, I mean, I think all the trainees in exams need to know the relevant papers that have been published in the New England. So like last week, we were talking about the National Lung Cancer Screening Trial. This is a paper everybody needs to know. Everybody needs to know the paper on emphysema. Okay, so there's certain key papers in the top journals that you must be aware of. Within the cardiothoracic surgery world, those the big four journals I talked about, I don't think there are too many papers that everybody knows. But if you can tell the examiner that this paper came from Annals or JTCVS, again, it helps. But I think even more important, though, are what journals to completely avoid. Because nowadays, as you know, Zamir, there are a lot of predatory journals out there, a lot of open access journals that are just out to make a buck. And they will publish all sorts of garbage, unfortunately. And there's some journals out there with such a bad reputation that if you quote it in your PhD thesis or in your grant application, very often you will be marked down for it. I've just been told by some of our Italian friends that there are certain predatory journals, if you quote that in your grant application, it will get rejected. I don't know if that will affect your exams, but be aware of these open access journals. Avoid them if you can.
Okay, so that's quite an important message. Do you have any names of these journals which should be avoided?
I don't know. Your webcast is going out around the world. Everyone gets sued.
That's fine. Now we won't put you on the spot. Now I'm going to ask another question from purely a student's point of view or a junior surgeon's point of view. There are two issues with publishing. One is, of course, the first and foremost is a lack of training or understanding why journals reject or accept. And a talk like this is very, very important to help the trainee understand what is the criteria for acceptance. But more importantly, there are two factors which come into play. One is time, and the second is clinical material. You know, I mean, everybody's working in a routine practice with very, very few people working in high-end surgical centers doing, you know, transplantation and stuff like that. So how do these people overcome these obstacles? You know, how do they decide that? Because they have to publish and time is limited. They have only 3 years of their postgraduate time. And then, you know, in the first few years when you're trying to establish a practice, you're desperate to publish. So how do we balance these two out? And you know, like, is it possible nowadays to publish on common topics, or does it really have to be high-end research that gets published?
No, I think it doesn't have to be high-end research, but it has to be, as I said, it has to be a clinically relevant question. In fact, common topics as an editor, I love them, because I know that if that paper gets published, everybody's going to feel, oh, this has relevance to me. If you talk about very rare disease, nobody cares. Now, going back to your original question, I mean, how do you overcome these obstacles? And from my own observations around the world, I think it all begins with your team. Within China, for example, the worst examples are always when the boss tells the resident, hey, you, go write me a paper within this year. And the resident goes off, I don't know what to do. And they always come up with some really garbage case reports, garbage study. The best units I've seen, for example, in Japan, are the ones where the boss actually sits down with the entire team every week or every month. They have a research meeting or an academic meeting. They don't necessarily force anybody to write, but they say, you know, okay, over the last year, we've done so many cases. You know, has anybody thought, oh, you know, does this make a difference? Or if I change this, will that make a difference? And together, the team, by brainstorming, that's where you come up with the ideas. And I think that definitely comes from leadership. The boss, a good boss like yourself, will lead the team and set the questions. Just throwing at the resident is surefire to disaster.
So a talk like this is even more important for the seniors in the specialty. That they must understand what it takes to publish a paper, isn't it? I mean,
absolutely. With any luck, with any luck, the seniors became senior because they have published papers. So
okay.
hopefully.
Now, when these juniors have written an article, even before writing an article, should they start off with choosing a journal? So when you choose a journal, there are two things. One is, of course, high volume publishers like yourself want to publish in high impact journals. But a poor young chap in Delhi wants to make sure his article is published. So
Yes.
how do we choose a journal? You know, what are the criteria to choose a journal where you want to publish your article?
Yeah, again, I think the best answer to this is to go back to the team. Never do it individually. And that's my advice for the younger surgeons. Never feel that, you have to do it yourself. All through the process, from initializing this project to collecting the data, analyzing the data, to writing, to selecting a journal, needs to be done with a mentor. So during the process of your study, as you analyze, it should become clear to you whether this is a very good study. If it is, you can aim higher. If you find out that the results are not that good, you can aim lower. So during the whole process, your aim for which journal might actually change. So and you need to be flexible like that. Very often when I'm supervising some of my own residents, I let them write the draft. And then once we've seen the draft, we know which journal we aim. We then rewrite the draft to fit that journal. So I think that's the better way to do it.
Yeah, so there's a very important point you just made, actually, that the technique of writing depends on the requirement of the journal. So even before you start writing, you need to go back to the index of the journal and find out how do they want the journal to be written? How do they want that article to be written? Isn't it? Because it changes. When you're writing for annals, it's a different style of writing as compared to when you're writing for a European journal. So,
absolutely.
So it's very important tip for all the juniors that don't write the article and then choose the journal. It's completely the opposite. Choose the journal, read the requirement of the journal, and then write the article.
Yeah,
then the editor is familiar with the language that you're going to be using, and you have to try and tally it with exactly what they've asked for. If when you go into the journals, instructions to authors is the most important piece of information that you need before you start writing the journal. So before you start writing the article. So almost everybody, this advice is for you, is that before you start writing, read the instruction for the authors. That's quite important. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. I mean, there's another thing that we could add to that is that what we've seen in a lot of surgical journals is that a paper submitted to us were very obviously submitted to a pulmonology journal first, got rejected, and these authors are so lazy, they didn't even bother reformatting it. And as soon as you receive it, the editor thinks, this guy is disrespectful to my journal, reject. Okay. So it's not very good. There's another thing too, that while you're mentioning which journal, is be aware of the readership of the journal. Because if you're writing to one of the big 4 cardiothoracic journals, you don't need to say lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer death in the world, blah, blah, blah. This is common knowledge to all readers of that journal. If you're writing it to a non-surgical journal, you might want to say a bit more, but make sure you're writing to the readership. If you don't tailor it right, again, the reviewers won't like it and they will give you bad comments.
Okay. Does it mean that if you're rejected by one journal, you will automatically be rejected by all other journals?
Oh, no, never. In fact, there are many stories of how authors submitted to what they thought was a lower class journal, got rejected, and for some strange reason, they submitted to a higher class journal, and it got accepted. You can never really predict. I think what you need to do every time you get a rejection is you need to take a breath first. Don't immediately react. If you react out of anger, and it will never help your paper. Put the paper away for a day or two, come back to it when you're calmer, read the reviewer comments carefully, and then you have to assess whether your paper is salvageable. Some papers are so bad, there's no way you can rework it into an acceptable stage. Just forget it, save your time, move on to another project. But if you read the reviewer comments and you think, wait a minute, I can address these, I can improve my paper if I make the changes, then it's probably worth revising and then submitting to a different journal.
Okay, coming to the reviewers' comments. I have personally seen, and I know it for a fact, that very often the big shot reviewers will actually pass it on to a junior registrar to review the paper, which essentially means that, you know, you might be good in your work, but really that understanding of the reviewer was not good enough because he was a junior registrar, rather than, you know, knowing the nuances of the surgical operation or whatever you're writing about. So should you take the reviewer's words seriously, or should you sort of, you know, say, no, let me retry in another journal where maybe the reviewers will be more sympathetic?
Yeah, two points to that answer. First of all, is that actually very often in my experience, a lot of these junior registrars, they write better reviewers than their bosses. Because, you know, the bosses are busy. They don't give a damn. They say, no, this paper is crap, and that's it. But a lot of the juniors actually write much better. So when I select my reviewers, sometimes I know which are the slightly younger ones, the ones, you know, sort of the really aggressive senior registrars. These are the best reviewers. And the other thing is, pay attention not just to the reviewers, but to the editor. A good editor will see through these comments, and they will know which comments are crap comments, which are the important ones. And a good reviewer in his, good editor, sorry, in his comments to the author will highlight which are the points that should be focused on. That's what I usually do as an editor. You know, you might have 15 different comments from a reviewer, but I sometimes direct the author, say, hey, please pay attention to these particular points. These are the make or break questions.
Okay. Now, rejection is not a good thing for you as an individual, not good thing for your ego, and not good thing for your confidence. Sometimes when the reviewer writes a review on rejecting an article, it can be quite harsh. And it might actually set you back 6 months to a year. I'll just give you an example. One of the papers which I had sent out actually had a reviewer commenting that this paper does not sound like it's written by an ethnic English-speaking author. Okay. Now, for me, as I'm just sharing it, I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying, for me, this comment was so humiliating and insulting because A, I live in England, B, I've been to a convent school, C, in IELTS, my score was 9 out of 9 in English. So, you know, it's so personally that it sets you back 6 months to a year. And to think that your paper is being rejected on the basis of language or, you know, terminologies is a huge setback. So I'm sharing this purely for the benefit of the juniors who will face this sort of rejection from their papers. How do you react to this, Alan, and how do you get over this thing and get back to send? That particular paper actually never got sent anywhere else, purely because I took it so personally. It's wrong on my part, but you know, you are a human being and you react to people's comments. And I personally blame the editor, because the editor could never have sent that comment to me. So it's just a sharing. So tell us, what do we...
From an editor's point of view, I mean, that's the important thing. The editors, when they see a comment like that, he has two things that he can do. First of all, I can censor the comments. And sometimes I do. If I find personal attacks or bad comments like that, I actually sometimes I just delete that line because it's not constructive.
It is not.
Other thing that editors do is that as soon as you see review comments like this, nowadays all the journals grade the reviewers. I would give this reviewer a very low mark, less than 10 out of 100, and I will make sure that this reviewer is never used again. And you're absolutely right. There are some really vicious, terrible, terrible reviewers out there. And we know who they are. And I know over the years, I've actually blacklisted a lot of them. So hopefully we're going to weed them out. But there are some out there. And interesting, you should mention this language thing again. And again, in my experience with the European journals, is that most people who comment on bad English themselves, they have terrible English.
Yeah, because they're Europeans and they don't speak.
Terrible. They look at your surname of the first author. If it's an Asian surname, they automatically say the English needs to be improved by a native English speaker. It's terrible. And over the years, I've just learned to ignore that. And my advice to a lot of the junior surgeons out there, don't pay too much attention to that. A good editor.
The message to the younger guys is that don't worry about rejection. It's part of life. In fact, initially, you might have a series of rejections and then suddenly it clicks in your mind, and then the next time or the next time or the next time you start getting papers getting accepted. So it's quite important to understand that. And that's why I shared this with you, Alan. Okay, another question, Alan. When you write a paper vis-a-vis writing an abstract for a conference, how do we change that? Because as you and I personally know, that different conferences have different levels of acceptance of abstracts. Yes. That they want a different style of presentation, things like that. So for the sake of the juniors, can you tell us how to write an abstract for a conference? Is it the same as writing a paper, or is it completely different?
It's not completely different. It's slightly different. It's a completely different talk, a different PowerPoint presentation. But just to summarize, here are a few tips. The number one thing you want to do when writing an abstract for a conference is write a good title. Now, that's a bit surprising because typically for a big international cardiothoracic meeting, each reviewer, like myself, in one weekend, I will review over 100 abstracts in one weekend. We all leave it till the last night. And when you're doing that, most reviewers read the title and they think, if you get a bad impression, I don't know what this is about. The rest of the abstract reading, they're going to have a bad impression already. So to write a good title for an abstract, use the PICO question. If you don't know what that is, the PICO question is, it has to contain patient, intervention, the control group, and then the outcome you're looking for. Okay, so for example, patient is in patients receiving thoracotomy for lung cancer, the intervention is, let's say, paravertebral blockade, and then the control group might be, say, epidural, and the outcome is, let's say, pain at 3 days. So your PICO title would be, in patients receiving thoracotomy for lung cancer, the use of epidural will reduce pain at 3 days compared to patients receiving epidural. Now that, in one simple sentence, will tell the reviewer exactly what he needs to know. And from that, he can already base his impression on whether to accept it or not. That's the number one tip. The second tip is, in the abstract, make your introduction and your conclusion, one, they have to match each other. You need to ask a question introduction. It has to match the conclusion. But both these sections need to be short. A big mistake that people do is they write a huge, long introduction. Introduction gets you no marks in an abstract marking because you're just talking about background. You're not talking about your study. What you need to do is you need to make your results section big, because then the reviewer thinks that if I accept your paper, when you stand on that stage, you will have something to tell the audience. If your results section is 2 sentences, I don't want to accept it because I know you have nothing to say. So that's another tip. Last tip is you need to highlight if you use good methodology. Is this a meta-analysis? Is it big data analysis? Is it prospective, randomized? What clever tricks you use in your methodology? Because a lot of the big meetings now, they give extra marks if you use big data, meta-analyses, prospective. So you use these hot keywords somewhere in your methods, and that will gain you marks.
Fantastic. Now, last 2 questions from my side before I throw it open to everybody. The first question is commercial studies, which have been sponsored by the industry. There is always this skepticism of the people reviewing these studies that the conclusion is influenced by the cash thrown at the study. So how do you deal with that? If you have been involved with a commercial study, how do you make sure that your presentation, your paper and your presentation turns out to be neutral?
That's purely your own judgment. There's a few things to avoid. if you're working with industry, never include anybody from industry as a co-author. And you'll be surprised how many times that some of these industry people manage to wangle themselves off as the next to last author. And as soon as we see that, that's a big no-no. Okay. The other thing is avoid adjectives in your conclusions. So if you're doing a commercial product, you're bound to end up saying that, oh, this is a revolutionary new treatment. It significantly improves outcomes, blah, 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 blah. Avoid subjective comments like that. Stick to what the data actually says. If you find yourself being too biased, ask a colleague to read through the paper for you. You're absolutely right. I totally agree with you. It's easy to be biased, but the best thing to do is get a proofreader to read through it for you.
Okay. One last question. A lot of us are torn. We're coming back to the impact factor question. A lot of us are torn between loyalties to our countries and our societies versus personal achievement of publishing in a big journal. As in, you know, I frequently have this problem where the Indian Journal of Cardiothoracic Surgery, which does not have an impact factor, will tell us, you know, you have to publish with us first. You know, if you don't publish with us, how will we rise in the you know, sequence of journals? So how do you balance this out? This is for the young guys. A lot of these young guys are actually publishing in the Indian Journal of Cardiothoracic Surgery, but doesn't have an impact factor. So, you know, what do they do?
You're absolutely right. I mean, I can see the allure of a big impact factor. But I think I go back to Gonzalo Varela's point, you know, about those 4 reasons why you're right. You have to ask yourself, why am I writing this paper to begin with? If this paper has a great message that the world needs to know, then to hell with it, I'm going to publish it in a global international journal. But if my message is very specific to a region or to a country, then yes, I would publish in my own country. For example, if I had a paper on TB in Hong Kong and how I treat it here, I mean, nobody in America is going to be interested in that. I would publish it in a local journal. But if I had a brand new technique that is applicable everywhere, then yeah, then it needs to reach a wider audience. And that is the important thing. If it reaches the right audience, even if the journal has a lower impact factor, the impact factor might be lower, but the real life impact that you're changing people's lives will be much greater.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. I mean, this discussion was, all these questions were meant to sort of, because I talk to these youngsters and these are the questions that come from the youngsters. So I'm going to throw this floor open to all the youngsters, and please feel free to ask. You can talk about your individual experience with your papers, or you can ask about what happened, you know, why this paper was rejected. Anything, really, we're open for discussion. So who wants to start? Whoever wants to start, unmute your microphone, introduce yourself, just say which institution, and then carry on.
Sir, Amol here, sir.
Yeah, Amol.
Oh, hello.
Hello, sir. Hello. It was a very nice and useful talk, sir. Sir, I have a question. In exams, if we are asked to critically appraise a paper and make conclusions out of that paper, how to go quickly on that paper and make our conclusions?
Okay. Well, you can start with what I was saying earlier, the 3 requirements from a journal, because reviewers review it the same way. So look at objectively at the quality of the science and the quality of the writing, first of all. Okay. Second is what the ultimate message is and what impact it's going to have for our peers. Now, that's the overview. Going more specifically, I think the most difficult part of critical appraisal for an exam will be in the quality part, especially the quality of the science. Now, when you assess quality of the science, you need to, one is the clinical question, is it well framed? Does the conclusion match that clinical question? That's the first thing. That's the introduction, conclusion, access. Secondly, in the methodology itself, have the right methods being selected to test that hypothesis. And it's usually quite obvious if it hasn't. Within that, the methodology, you need to assess whether they've defined the selection criteria correctly. Again, to make the method relevant to the clinical question asked. So it all comes back to the clinical question, and have they defined their outcome measures correctly? In the results, have they actually displayed all the relevant results? Okay, because very often it's not in the initial entire cohort comparison that you get an interesting result. Often it's a subgroup analyses or the more intricate analyses. As a reviewer yourself in the exam, ask yourself, have all the relevant subgroups been analyzed? You need to, again, look at whether all the patients have been followed up properly and fully. If not, have they been accounted for? The discussion, personally, I don't usually put too much emphasis in critical appraisal, because discussion, discussion typically is the author speculating. It's a lot of subjective opinion. So you can't really criticize it too much. It's just their opinion. But again, have they compared their study, put it into the context of the relevant publications? That's another thing you can see in your exam. If you can tell the examiner that, I've read this paper, but I know of these other papers that are relevant to this project, you can impress the examiner. Okay, and that's how I would go about it. The last thing, look at the reference list. Always look at the reference list, because that's an easy target for you to critically appraise. If you look at, if they have 20 references and 10 of them are from 1980s, this is a crap list. Or if they're not relevant, you can always criticize that as well.
Couple of things that I want to add to this, Alan, is that when we give you a critical appraisal to do in the exam, it's not a critical appraisal of the clinical question. It's a critical appraisal of the paper. Remember this. I've seen a lot of students answer whether, is pleurectomy the right treatment for pneumothorax. That's not the point. The point is, tell us whether this paper is good or bad. One important thing that you've got to remember is you must know a little bit of basic statistics. You must talk about, is the power of the study good? How have they calculated the power of the study? You must look at the inclusion criteria and the exclusion criteria. And also important to understand which are the ones that they have not used in the analysis. Very often, some outliers are actually rejected from the analysis. And so these are important highlights that you've got to say when you're talking about the paper. Also the statistical methods that are used. So what we're trying to see is, do you understand statistics? Do you understand what is a parametric test and what is a non-parametric test? Have they used correct statistics to analyze their data? And more importantly, actually, I slightly differ from Alan on the point that discussion usually gives me a great insight into the mind of that author. And I want to know whether he has acknowledged the limitations of the study or not. And if he has acknowledged, has he acknowledged in the correct way or not? And very often when you start critically analyzing a paper, look at the limitations straight away, which the author has discussed in the discussion, and reread the paper from the start, and then you'll pick up points how to critically appraise that paper. Because he said that I excluded everybody over 60. You know immediately that there is a group which you can start criticizing. Or you can say that, but this disease is more common in everybody over 60. So you have really excluded a large part of the population. So I read the discussion quite carefully, because it gives me an insight into what is this guy thinking. Is he trying to pull wool over my eyes? Or is he honest enough to say, listen, we did this, may not be a great study, may not be statistically this thing, but I'm honest enough to say this is what has happened. And if he is doing that, then usually these are okay papers. That's my take on it, Alan. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with what you say, but the discussion, though, ultimately, it's subjective discussion. So if you're critically appraising the quality of the science, that doesn't apply. It applies in the quality of writing. It might be a lousy written discussion. But speculation is one thing. Limitations, absolutely. But most papers, when they write limitations, it's the usual limitations. It's, ours is a retrospective study. Our cohort is too small. And it's the usual kind of thing. What you want to pay attention to, if you are doing that, is, does the fact that it's a retrospective study how does that affect the conclusions? Sometimes it doesn't. And so it's not that big a limitation. A small study, well, if it's a very rare disease, you're going to have a small cohort anyway. So yeah, there are limitations that you can read, but you also need to pay attention to, in the exam, you need to argue with the examiner why this limitation makes an effect in your paper. Now, regarding the clinical question, I agree with you. What the clinical question is, that's you can't really criticize it too much because that's what the reviewer, the author, started out writing about. But for you as a reviewer, as an examinee, you need to absolutely pay attention to the clinical question because your entire critical appraisal of this paper stems from your understanding of that clinical question. Because as you critique the methodology, the results, the discussion, and the conclusion, you need to argue with the examiner, why are these things relevant to the question that the author asked? If the author asked about A, but he ended up doing a study on B, that whole study is completely a waste of time.
Okay. Next question, please.
Sir, Dr. Shashikiran here, sir.
Yeah.
From him.
Hi.
Hi, sir. It was a very nice discussion. Sir, whenever we are planning to write a paper, what do you suggest? We can start with it by designing the title, and then should we write try to gather the relevant articles along with it to write the discussion? Some part of the some part of the discussion. If you're writing a review or something, then if you're we should write the introduction first, or should we gather all the articles, write some part of the discussion, and then plan to introduce the topic later?
If you're writing a review article, okay, if you're writing a review article, I think a traditional review article, it's now, as I said just now, it's nowadays the chances of getting accepted are quite low unless you're aiming for a very low impact factor journal, because there's so much literature out there and it's so easy to search, whether it's by PubMed or Ovid or Google, that you're never going to do a comprehensive review of any topic nowadays. Thoracic surgery is too big. So if you are going to write a review article, I think the first thing to do is to, as I said, focus on a specific clinical question. Don't say, I'm going to write a review article on VATS. It's too big. Focus it on a certain subset, a very niche group, and then write a methodology for yourself. How am I going to search for papers relevant to that topic that I framed? Okay, so it's a sort of a systematic review. Okay, and that will already answer your initial question, you know, what papers I select. Do it systematically. Have an objective methodology. Search the PubMed or whatever. Get the list of papers and then do an abstract review. Select the best quality papers for a full text review. Do it systematically, and that will not only make your life easier, it will increase the chances of your review being accepted. Now, as to whether the order of how you write, a lot of people ask, should I write introduction first, method first, results first, or whatever? That's very individual. Everybody I talk to has a different way of doing it. Personally, I just start from the beginning and right to the end because it's easy for me. But everybody has a different way of doing it. Some people like writing the results first, and then they write the methods, and then they write introduction and discussion. But it's totally up to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any more questions from the audience? I know it's late in the night, even later for Alan, actually.
Oh, no worries.
But any more questions?
Hi. Yes.
Hi, Lavi.
Yes, sir. Sir, I have two.
Who is
Hi,
that?
sir. Sir, I have two questions.
Yeah.
This is Pallavi, sir, from NITRD Delhi.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sir, my first question is, suppose when we are writing an article and we are saying, using a reference, say, it was mentioned, say XYZ line has been mentioned in NEJM and we are using that as a reference. What happens is when we are sending it to the publisher, they say that it's beat text. So are we supposed to change the lines of what the author has written already? X et al. Has mentioned this in his study. So are we supposed to change that as well while we are writing?
Not really. Usually if you're quoting another paper, you're only quoting a little bit. and that's usually quite acceptable.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't copy and paste.
Yeah, but what happens is when they go yeah, but what happens is when they go do a copy and paste onto their, they have this electronic way of checking
That's
whether
right.
we are doing pilferage, and
That's
therein
right.
it comes as it's a repeat. So how do I get out of that problem?
Yeah, you cannot, as I said, you cannot copy and paste whole paragraphs. I mean, if it's just one particular phrase, you know, or even a sentence, usually it's okay. Now, you're right about the software, and for the others in the audience, all journals now automatically, even before it comes to my inbox as an editor, the computer system automatically does this search for similarities of other papers. It's done literally in seconds, and we can tell. Now, usually, if it goes above a certain percentage of overlap or similarity with a previous paper, it will get flagged up for attention by the editors. So if you get maybe 5, 6, 7% similarity with another paper, that gets flagged up. So that gives you an idea of how much similarity it is. So if you have, you're writing your discussion, this other paper said a certain phrase, if you just, copy those words in that phrase, okay, that probably won't hit the 5% limit. But if you copy and paste an entire paragraph, forget it. That will instantly get flagged. Okay, so don't copy and paste whole paragraphs. 1 or 2 short phrases, a certain expression, that's fine.
Alan, what about similarities with your own previous papers? As in, you have a certain style of writing, and you have written on the topic previously. You're now addressing a different angle to the topic, but your style of writing remains quite similar. So how do you look at that? At your own paper, do they say, "Oh, that's a copy and paste," or do they say?
Oh yeah, well, absolutely. You have to treat your own papers like somebody else's papers. Don't copy and paste. Style writing is okay, but if you're, word for word, verbatim, you're copy and pasting, the software will detect that. Okay. Very often, if you're quoting yourself, you're probably expressing a result that you found in a previous study. You're probably quoting your own technique of surgery in a previous paper, or a certain opinion that you've expressed in an old paper. So instead of copy and pasting, you can just say, our technique has already been described, and then put a reference to your old paper. And that will get you out of that. So don't copy and paste even your own old paper, but you can refer to it in your new paper with a reference.
Is it a good way? Is it a good way to increase the citation by quoting your own paper?
Good point. Now, a certain amount of self-citation is allowed, but too much self-citation is not good. For an author, if an editor or the editorial staff notice that, wow, 50% of your references are your own papers, the editor will usually make a comment about that. The other thing is journals are not allowed to self-cite. Every year, Thomson Reuters gives us a report on each journal that we publish. And we look at our own self-citation rate. If journal X cites itself more than 30% of the time, that will get flagged up. And the journal will be warned that if you continue this practice, we might knock off your index next year. Stuff like that. So yeah, we are aware of that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Pallavi, you had a...
Yeah, sir, I have one more question. Suppose I'm reading an article and I like a survey questionnaire that they have used. Just because it is published, can I use that survey for my study, or do I need author's permission?
You want to use that question that they asked?
Questionnaire that they have used for a similar study that I do in my patient scenario. So
the entire questionnaire, you mean? Yeah, if it's an entire questionnaire that somebody's already published, you need to ask their permission. So just write, they're usually fine. Just write to the corresponding author. It says, I like your questionnaire, can I use it in my study? And usually it's not a problem. It's just being polite.
No.
And if it is a validated questionnaire, even then I need to seek permission. Something like SF36 I'm using without taking permission.
Yeah, SF36, be careful. You have to pay for these. A lot of these questionnaires are actually owned by certain groups, okay? So some of them you actually need to pay. Some of the questionnaires are just, just homemade questionnaires by a guy in the hospital X, and those you can write to them, and they'll give you the questionnaire and you can use it. But for, things like EORTC or SF36 or McGill Pain Questionnaire. Be careful. A lot of these, they actually charge.
Because they have been
So,
copyrighted.
yeah.
They have been copyrighted.
Yeah, they have copyright, absolutely.
Copyrighted.
But so the SF36 website says that you can use it if you uphold the disclaimer that they are not responsible for misuse of the questionnaire.
Yeah, I haven't used SF36 in some time now, so I forgot. Yeah, maybe you're right. But yeah, you need to pay attention to their regulations. So if they say you need to pay, you need to pay. If you need to quote them, you need to quote them. So whatever they ask for, be careful. Don't infringe copyright, otherwise you'll be in big trouble.
Okay. So suppose Thoraco score is such an old score, sir. If I want to use that for a study in Indian setting, I need to seek permission from somebody who devised the score.
Yeah, go to the Thoraco score website and see what their requirements are. I don't think Thoraco score is a paid for thing. I can't remember who owns it.
No, Alan, but you need permission. The French group owns it.
Yeah, that's right. The French group.
The French group, what's his name? Professor Dussault's group owns it. And,
yeah.
You need their permission. You cannot use any questionnaire without permission, because at the end of the day, you might use it, but the problem happens when you go to publish this paper. And the moment you publish this paper, it becomes international knowledge. Nowadays, you cannot hide. I mean, the world has become so small. You might think that I'm just using it in NITRD Delhi, but tomorrow you could be presenting this paper in ESTS, and if I was in the audience, I would ask you, how the hell do you use this questionnaire without my permission? So it's always like Alan said, you just send a polite email. It's not very difficult these days. Find out the author and send a polite email, and most of the times they will reply back saying yes, they will give you permission, and save that email very carefully. Some questionnaires have a charge associated with it. That is quite true. So any questionnaire which is not designed by you, you must ask for permission. Which also includes slides and things like that. Like Alan has just done this presentation, and we are recording it and we are putting it out there on YouTube. That's for general knowledge. But if somebody is going to copy that and put it into his own presentation in a meeting, that is seriously frowned upon, because that is not the right thing to do, and you will be taken to task for that.
Oh, it's terrible. Every week, somebody's using my slides without telling me.
I mean, in fact, just for you guys, for your knowledge, I have requested a lot of people to give talks on this forum, and quite a few English surgeons have refused to do it because we are recording it and we are putting it out there. I mean, it's petty-minded, but it is their right to say yes or no, and the no is on the basis that this is being recorded and put on YouTube. And the one question they ask you is this commercial? And if there is commercial benefit, how does it benefit us? So we have to sort of give the disclaimer that this is not commercial benefit. So Alan and I and a few other guys who will lecture on this, we're different. Our thought processes are different. But a lot of people who want to lecture, they don't want to give out their slides that easily.
Yeah. While we're on the topic of copyright, be aware that even your own work, you might not own the copyright to that. I've written papers where I've quoted myself or used diagrams or tables from one of my old papers, and I still needed to get copyright off my own old papers.
From the journal. Because
the journal, yeah.
Because when we submitted, we actually signed a disclaimer saying we don't own the copyrights. The journal takes over the copyrights. Like in ESTS, when you are submitting an abstract, we did a lot yesterday, and every single abstract before you submit it, you've actually got to tick the box saying that they have the copyright over this.
Mm.
If you accept that, then they will consider it for shortlisting. Okay, next question, please. I think it's been a fantastic discussion on a very dry topic, isn't it, Alan?
No, it's great.
But I think it's a good discussion and a lot of learning for everybody. So, any more questions, guys? Are you happy?
Sir, Amol here, sir.
Yeah, hi. Yeah.
Sir, this is regarding the Indian scenario.
Okay.
Sir, many of us will be working in a small center in a periphery, and we might not be having access to the very costly molecular tests and all those things, and we resort to the basic research like chest tube drainage and pain management, all those things. So how to make this simpler topics presentable to the global audience. How to make it a better paper, being in spite of being basic research.
And no, that's very, very relevant. Most of us don't have access to these fancy labs. Even myself, you know, in all the hospitals I work, I don't always have access to these molecular things. And to be honest, that molecular doesn't make it interesting. A lot of the interesting stuff is what we as surgeons see day to day. So it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I think one of the best ways to do it is to do it as a team. So you guys do ward rounds in your hospital every day. So, you know, as you do a ward round, as you see patients, you might notice, oh, you know, today when we do a ward round, I saw 3 patients who had this happen in their chest drains. You know, that's a bit odd. And then within the team, you know, you might have over coffee, over breakfast, you might say, you know, why is that? And then somebody might say, maybe it's because of this. This is how we look at it. And then together, we formulate a study in mind. It doesn't have to be a molecular fancy thing. It could even be a retrospective thing. I saw these 3 things in these 3 patients today. Maybe it's more common than we think. Maybe if we look back over the last 1 year, we would find even more. So that might be the beginning of a study. So I think a lot of the interesting studies are just like this. Because if you start like that, and you bring it, say to ESTS, the meeting, and you say, this is something you notice on your ward round, the guys at ESTS will say, hey, wait a minute, that's what I saw too. But I never found the answer to that. Now you've given me the answer. That is how you make a good, simple study. Okay, together in your ward rounds, day-to-day things.
Amol, don't be under the impression that, you know, in a small center in India, you don't have quality stuff. I can tell you, working in the UK, within the NHS and in India, I think a lot of Indian centers are far ahead of the game than the UK NHS. And a lot of studies, if you go to the UK society meetings, a lot of studies are all just like this. At what point should you do a chest x-ray in the recovery? You know, should it be 4 hours? Should it be 6 hours? Should it be 8 hours? The only thing is that they do it in a very, you know, within the boundaries of clinical audit and within the boundaries of clinical governance and nice guidelines. So because you do it all within these national and international guidelines, your paper gets validity. But I promise you, a lot of papers coming out of the UK are not high-end at all. They are just basic stuff, but they get picked up because they have the background of clinical audit or clinical research, or, you know, the methodology is sound. It's not the question, it's the methodology is sound. The only place where you struggle, Amol, when I say you, I mean the Indian juniors,
Yes, sir.
is because they don't understand the methodology.
Yes, sir.
It's important to make a good methodology and any paper will get accepted. More common
Yes,
the
sir.
question, the more people can relate to it.
So
Yes, sir.
tomorrow morning, when you guys do your ward rounds with your bosses, you know, as you see each patient, ask some questions. Hey, boss, why are we putting so much suction on this patient? If he can answer you, that's fine. If he can say, oh, look at this paper, that's fine. If he says, I don't know, and there are no papers on it, there's your next project.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thanks for the tips, sir.
Within the Indian society meetings, the problem is most of the papers come in as purely on quantity. Like, I have done 1,000 tuberculosis patients, so I'm the world's greatest surgeon. Or I have done, you know, 800 pneumonectomies. And actually, it's completely the opposite. Why have you done 800 pneumonectomies? Maybe you should be doing sleeve lobectomies. You understand that? So it's not the numbers that matters. It's the methodology that's important. It's really, if you understand the science behind it and how did you reach an answer, then that's fine. It will get accepted.
Yes,
Okay.
sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
No. Anybody else who has any more questions?
Sir, one last question.
Yeah, who's that?
Shashi Kiran here.
Yeah, Shashikaran, tell me.
Sir, you were telling about maintaining databases. I mean, one of the problems that we face is we will be seeing so many cases, but we are not maintaining the data along with it. So we are missing out with presenting so many things that we are managing.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So how can we try to improve in that?
Okay, a few things. I mean, you need to make a commitment to it, and you need to do it immediately. what we found in Hong Kong when we're doing our database is if we leave it till the end of the week, or even worse, leave it till the end of the month to enter the data, nobody's going to do it because it piles up. You have a whole stack on your desk. You need to do, as soon as you finish that operation, you need to enter it. Now, if you do that and you still find there's too many, you need to set targets for yourself. Maybe you can't do every single operation into the database. So maybe just select a certain group. Maybe I'll start off with just the empyemas. Okay, and once you get the hang of that, then you can start adding on your pneumothorax cases as well. So do separate databases for each separate disease group, and it's a bit more manageable. Another tip that you can use is that instead of making your own database from scratch, it's not that difficult. This is just an Excel file, but for some people, it's too much hassle. What you can do is you can use existing databases that are available for free. For example, if you join the ESTS, you automatically can enter data into the ESTS database, and you can always access your data in their database yourself. If you want to access other people's data in that database, you have to apply for it. But I mean, the platform's there already, free. So you know, you can make use of these freebies. Yeah.
Let me just come in on that, Alan. Shashikaran, I think this is a very valid question you've asked. It's a real life problem that we all face, and more so in the Indian scenario, it is true. Now, my answer to you is, Shashikaran, that this is a state of mind. You know, if I ask all of you who are on this conference call, how many of you are filling in your own logbook every day or every 2 days? The answer will be, I think, none. 0 out of the whole lot, to be honest. Your logbook is not up to date. You know, it might be 6 months, it might be 1 year, or in some cases even 3 years out of date. Because the only time it gets up to date is when you're about to go for an exam. So it is a mindset, it is a thought process. The most important thing is what is the carrot at the end of that database. That is the only way to address this. Stronger the carrot, stronger the chances of you filling in data. In the DNB MCH exam, you cannot give the exam if your logbook is not filled in. So the carrot is very strong. But that carrot happens once in 3 years. So you know, the last 3 months when you're filling in the form, the last week before the deadline of the form, you're filling in your logbook. You understand that? So it is all about thought process. And so keep very strong carrots. Best carrot is to do studies, do clinical studies, and you know, keep short studies. If you keep a 3-year study, chances are you will not fill in stuff till the last year. So do small studies, do, you know, few weeks, few months, small studies, so that it's a shorter period within which you have to fill in the data to get an answer. So it's all about a carrot and a stick approach. And honestly, next time you ask this question, ask yourself, did I fill in my logbook? And if you haven't filled in your logbook, which is your own advertisement to the world, then what is the chance that you will fill in a database on pneumothorax or on empyema? You understand that. So I'm not criticizing you. I'm sort of trying to make you understand that it is, you need to change the mindset. Alan is in a different league because he sits on a journal's editorial, and he, for him, publishing is life. You know, he's sitting here at, you know, 1:30 in the night doing a lecture for you guys. But what is he doing till 1:30? He was writing some papers. He was trying to finish stuff. So his carrot is very strong. He has tasted blood. And he is now a man-eating tiger. He cannot survive without writing a paper because he wants to see his work out there in the thing. And that is the mentality that you need to get. It will not happen overnight. It will start, you know, it is small steps, baby steps you take. Keep baby targets, make sure you achieve them. First way to do it is just fill in your logbook. Honestly, just every week at the end of the week before the Friday, the logbook must be up to date. If you can do your logbook, you will do any other Excel sheet in the world. That's all. You have to prove it only once to yourself. If you can prove it once to yourself, everything else is possible. Okay?
Yes.
Does that make sense, Alan, what I said?
Absolutely.
It's quite important to understand that. Okay. Any more questions? Are we happy?
Sir, I have one question. It's slightly unrelated, but if I may.
No problem.
The lady always gets the last word. So go ahead.
Sir, the magic number 33 when we say for a pilot study, is it very relevant? If we don't know the prevalence or anything, is 33 sufficient?
Sorry, 33?
That is absolute rubbish. Okay.
I've never heard of that one.
No magic number. It is only in the DNB corridors that you hear the magic number of 33. I have never
33?
come across that a pilot study has to have 33 patients. That is rubbish. I heard this before, and my answer
Really?
is the same. That is rubbish. That's absolute rubbish. There is no scientific basis to it, and it's only in the DNB corridors and the because I sit on the the ethics committee of my hospital in India, particularly when I'm passing the DNB thesis, and a lot of people come up with this magic number of 30, 33. That is rubbish. That's absolute rubbish. If I was you, I would not mention it ever again.
Yeah, I totally agree.
There's no science in it, and nobody in the world talks about it, except.
So, sir, for a negative study to validate it, if I don't know the prevalence, how do I go about getting my sample size? I don't have the prevalence.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. I see what you're trying to do, but regardless of whether it's a pilot study or whether it's a definitive study, a study only needs to be as big as whatever you're trying to prove. Okay, so there's no magic number, 33 or whatever. If you're doing an actual study, a comparative study, and you're doing sample size analysis, you're absolutely right. You need a prevalence. Now, the easiest way to start is, one, you can refer to other similar studies that have done previously to get a rough idea of the prevalence of a certain condition, and you can use that to calculate estimate a sample size. Two, you can do a retrospective analysis of whatever data you have in the previous patients. That might give you some idea. If you fail in these two measures, then you probably need a pilot study. Now, the pilot study, again, there's no 33. I've never heard of 33 before, but it depends on how common that disease is, what you're trying to prove. If you're trying to prove, for example, a complication that only occurs normally, I mean, very rarely, and maybe in 1% of patients, then you probably need a fairly big pilot study just to show that 1%. If you only do 33, you're never, and you have no complications, it doesn't mean anything. Okay, so it really depends, and there's no magic number. It depends on what you're looking for and some estimate from the previous literature and your own data.
No, Alan, can I just add a point here?
Yeah.
The one single most important factor which determines what number of patients go into your pilot study is your budget. Depending upon what is the budget that is available to you to do the study, you know, if a set of tests costs 3,000 rupees and you've got only 30,000, then the pilot study is 10 patients. That's the bottom line. So very often all across the globe, we find this, and we've seen it even in my boy who's doing the DNB thesis, is that we had this similar problem. The number of cases that you need to do is determined by what is the budget that you have to allocate to the study. And then you will be able to decide that. And then you interpret the data and hope that you can find a prevalence or things like that. So there is no number to the pilot study. I think most of us struggle because of budgets. And the problem is you cannot apply for a bigger budget till you have shown something in your pilot study. So it is a very difficult situation. And there is no right or wrong to this.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. So I think it's getting pretty late in the night, and I think we've had a really fantastic discussion. We've been going on for almost 2 hours, Alan, and blimey, we're still awake.
I'm fine.
Yeah, no, this is amazing. And the important thing is what I want you to again realize, Alan, is this is the way for us to go. I said this last time as well, is that some of these guys are lying down on their beds, and some of these guys are, you know, on call in their on-call rooms, and they are here listening to stuff, trying to understand the science. And I think we really, as you and I, as people who are promoting education, I think we need to look at it quite sincerely, because the formal setting may not actually be the setting of the future. You know, it has a place, but maybe we need to get into their bedrooms and get into their coffee rooms to be able to teach them where they are, and that might be more receptive. I don't mind if the core group is 10 or 20, but really we made a difference to 20 people in a big way. So that's the way. So thank you very much, Alan. I really appreciate what you're doing for us. And I hope that in future you might be able to get some more time for us on
Absolutely.
specific topics. Obviously, I won't push you because I understand that there's lots happening in your life and in my life as well. But I think we should get together and do this more often. And thank you very much to everybody for staying awake till so late and asking really relevant questions. You make me feel proud when you ask these questions. I feel that, I feel like a proud Indian when you guys ask these questions. So as Alan was saying, he wrote to me after the last talk that your bunch of thoracic trainees are really bright. And, that made me feel very happy. So carry on, guys. And
I just want to thank everybody in the audience as well. I mean, you guys, for me, you guys are very stimulating. Every time you ask a question, it doesn't just help you; it helps me, and I renew myself every time we do something like this. So thanks, Samir, for this, and thank you for everybody for staying up with us. You've been fantastic.
Yeah, I'm going to meet Alan on Thursday in Bangkok, and we're going to be spending some time together. As I told you, Alan, my wife is very jealous of you, because we always spend time together in exotic locations.
Oh,
but
yes.
it doesn't. So thank you very much for everything. And I'm going to end this meeting. Is that okay, guys?